NFL training camp is right around the corner. Which head coaches are on the hot seat? We'll answer that question right now on Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi again, everyone, and welcome into a Wednesday edition of Locked On NFL. He is Chris Carter. I'm James Rapien. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Follow Locked On NFL wherever you get your podcasts. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And Chris, training camp less than a month away. Rookies reporting in just over 3 weeks. So we are almost there, my friend. And almost there means that much closer to the start of the regular season. Also means that much closer to coaches, well, being on the hot seat. And that's what we're going to discuss today. When you think of coaches on the hot seat right now, which of the 32 NFL head coaches comes to mind first?
I always look to coaches who have been around and haven't been making progress or haven't been taking steps forward or haven't been overcoming adversity. And I think that there's things about that like, well, wait a second, like, was this supposed to be the time when this team was winning Super Bowls and they're not even making the playoffs, or they struggle and they falling apart? And so I think of teams like that. And I particularly think you could point to one specific division where there's one team that got a new coach, and there's three coaches who I think are all really on hot seats, and that's the NFC East. Because I think you have, and we will talk about Mike McCarthy in depth at some point, but you have McCarthy with the Cowboys, you have Sirianni with the Eagles. Both his coordinators were fired last year. That's a sign, if anything else. It's like, look, we're giving you the benefit of the doubt this time around, but you better deliver soon. And then there's Brian Daboll, who didn't exactly have it. Everyone thought like, oh man, the Giants are taking steps forward, and then last year they took 2 steps backwards. So I look at the NFC East in general, James, and that's where I have a big circle around coaches that should not feel easy right now. I think it makes the NFC East race even that much more important when watching it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because you look at the NFC East, and I think Mike McCarthy, at least for me, leads the way there of guys on the hot seat. But Nick Sirianni's not far off. And if they start this year the way they ended last year in Philly, especially with the offseason changes they made, pretty easy to see a path where that seat gets really, really hot, really, really quick. That fan base is not patient. We know how passionate Eagles fans are. And so, yeah, I think he's certainly there. The Brian Daboll one's so interesting, because I agree with you, especially after the way he started, where he gets into the playoffs and then they pay Daniel Jones, and then it goes down this route where they struggle last year, win 6 games. But where are your expectations for the Giants? Because I don't expect them to be good. And that's why Brian Daboll, if he is on the hot seat, heck, if he does end up getting fired, he's one of those guys where I would be open to hiring him, because I think it's a really tough situation right now in New York.
I agree, it's a tough situation. I just think that oftentimes, especially with franchises, that are big like the Giants and the Cowboys, who have shown that they're willing to move on from guys when things just aren't working. I think that's where he's at risk. When you coming off a 6-11 season, you do another season like that, that's when you start to lose the locker room. That's when like key players like Thibodeau, guys that they've been investing in, trying to keep around and trying to build their new nucleus around. If those guys start to not believe in him, and it starts to become visible during games or in the locker room or behind the scenes where the owner can see it, and they start seeing like, I don't know. That's where I think Daboll would be in trouble. Yes, I think anyone logically would look at the Giants situation and be like, "Woof, that would be a rough situation to have to deal with right now." But at the same time, this is going to be, it's kind of an acknowledgement that's like, okay, but you got to find a way to fight through it. I think a perfect example is look at what Mike Tomlin dealt with the Steelers. They've had multiple years where they've had bad quarterback play, or they've had lots of injuries on defense and key positions, and yet they're always in the hunt. They're always staying afloat. And I know that Mike Tomlin's a high bar to tell a coach to reach, but I think that's what it takes if you want to keep a job like Mike Tomlin, who just signed a 3-year extension with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I think for Daboll, the reason I'm putting him there is if he has another really bad season, I'd be eager to see, or I guess I'd be interested to see how his players take that. And like, if there's like a strong wave of support from the team, the organization, it's like, you know what, Brian, take all the time you need. You're going to figure this out. Or if it's going to be like, you know what, this guy just had one decent season and then had 2 really bad ones. And so that's where I think he could be on the hot seat. But Sirianni is the person I think that may have the most pressure on him, because Philly is not patient. And I say that as a person who lived in the Philly area for 4 years and who has lots of friends who are Eagles fans, and I joke with them all the time about this. But like the quick turn that went from him, they were on the cusp of beating the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. It was one Jalen Hurts fumble that went for a touchdown the other way. If that play doesn't happen, maybe they're Super Bowl champions right now, and none of this really matters. But now we saw at the last season, with the way that they crumbled at the end, fans were booing him, fans were throwing food on him after games when they were losing. It got really rough. And I think Nick Sirianni is at a point, like, look at Doug Peterson. Doug Peterson won Philadelphia, its first Super Bowl ever, and was gone like 2 years later. So to me, Sirianni, I think he may have the hottest seat of all, even though Mike McCarthy should be up there too.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think you're right. The more I think about it, I would have said McCarthy and ranked McCarthy coming into this episode as the hottest seat. But Jerry Jones has been pretty patient.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what else he's been this offseason? Is cheap.
Yeah.
Mike McCarthy's like, hey, what are you giving me? You didn't pay Dak. You haven't extended CD. Ezekiel Elliott is my top running back. They haven't paid Stephon Gilmore. Diggs is coming back from the serious knee injury. So like, you have all of these elements as to why the Cowboys will probably take a step back. And maybe that's why Jerry didn't spend, is because he knows that this is probably it for McCarthy. He'll give him one more year and then go from there. But for Sirianni, the Eagles did, and they were pushing the limits a bit. And they did go get Saquon Barkley, and they did add to their secondary, and they were aggressive in the draft in addressing it with who a lot of people thought were the 2 top defensive backs in this draft class. They were able to land both of them. And so, yeah, I think I agree with you now. But the more I think about it, because you have the weapons, you paid Devonta Smith, you paid A.J. Brown. Obviously, Jalen Hurts got his contract. They add to the defense. The Eagles better bounce back. You added Saquon. I mean, where's the hole? Where's the flaw? There aren't many flaws with that roster.
If they don't deliver this year, and when I mean deliver, I mean back to being like NFC Championship contenders. Like, they need to get in the playoffs, look good in the playoffs, and show like, hey, we're either in the Super Bowl or right on the cusp of it. And if he doesn't get there, if they have another disappointing season, first of all, wouldn't want to be in Philly, because Philly gets restless when they're disappointed, and wouldn't want to be Nick Sirianni, because I think that the Eagles would move on from him and say, we have a core here, we have talent, we need to figure this out now.
Up next, we'll continue the conversation. We will branch out of the NFC East and discuss some other coaches who could be under fire here or could be feeling the heat a bit going into training camp. We will do that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all of the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.
We're back here on the Locked On NFL podcast. We're your hosts, Chris Carter and James Rapien. We're talking about coaches on the hot seat in the NFL. And I wanted to focus on the NFC East specifically there because I just think that's a cluster of coaches in a tough spot. And I like you, I do think Mike McCarthy should be on the hot seat. But like you said, we've seen Jerry Jones be a bit more patient. But now let's look around the league a little bit more. Is there another coach outside of the NFC East that you think should be the hair should be standing up on their neck? They should be doing everything within their power to protect their job right now because of the situation that they've built for themselves over their past few years and the situation that they still have right now.
Yeah, I think when you look outside of the NFC East, and they do scream. I pulled up the standings. Full disclosure, I pulled up the standings, and I'm like, all right, what coaches stand out? And the East does scream at you, but it certainly isn't just the East. I do think that the next one, well, it is the East. It's just the other East. Robert Saleh with the Jets. I don't know how you can't look at that situation. And there's another coach there too that I'm going to get to. But that Jet situation, how is he not next in the, all right, well, you better win this year. He might be, just because of where the age of the quarterback and all those things, his seat might be hotter than anyone's. Because if they get off to a slow start, not that he'll get fired mid-year, I don't know that, because I'm not sure who they have that would replace him in-house. But you could certainly see the scenario where they know halfway through the year that they're not bringing him back for 2025.
I think that there's certainly the AFC East is certainly a division to watch there. I always get torn up with coaches, and when they're in like we're Robert Saleh with the Jets, that is a very small window, right? And that's a window that kind of just opened up because of the whole Aaron Rodgers situation. If the Aaron Rodgers situation isn't working out, do you then also chuck out your coach and say, all right, well, we're going to go back to trying to be a more defensive led team like we were hoping to get with Robert Saleh in the first place? Or do you say, you know what? No, we need to kind of adapt and get away from this guy because it just hasn't worked out there. But I also think a lot of this ultimately still comes down to the thing that we were talking about with the NFC East, especially with the Giants. Can you keep the locker room behind you? Because if the locker room believes in you, if the owner sees that, oftentimes that's enough to sway the owner to be like, you know what, if the top guys that I pay want to keep you, you'll be kept. Now, there's times it doesn't happen. There's times that coaches get let go and and some of the players like, what the heck, man? Like, that was the guy that was keeping me around. But I think most owners, they want the wins, they want the revenue, they want to make sure that, like, hey, are we showing that we're getting closer to being a Super Bowl contender? But if you're not, and you're having to decide, is this guy, the coach that I want? Oftentimes it's, how does he keep this locker room together? And I think that that's the big question there. I think another question will be Sean McDermott. When you look at Saleh in the East, I think McDermott's right with him. Listen, the Bills have been right on the cusp for many years now, but now we're starting to see the impact of when you pay Josh Allen that kind of money and you don't capitalize, and now you're paying other guys serious money. You're not going to have as well supported of a roster as they've had in some of these past years. And so for McDermott, man, I feel like if it is a tough division. You got the Dolphins, you got the Jets, the Patriots, who knows what they'll be like with their new coach. But I look at McDermott, and I feel kind of awkward with him and around. I'll be like, if you don't get it done, how soon would they move on? So like, we need Josh Allen to get someone else in here, because they have they been to an AFC Championship game yet, or have they lost in the AFC Championship game and not been to? And I know they haven't been to a Super Bowl yet. But I mean,
they've been in. Yeah, they lost in the divisional round. They've been in an AFC Championship game. Yeah,
with Josh Allen, that seems like such a problem. When he's been one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL for a few years now.
And McDermott is complicated. So he just signed an extension last year.
I know.
So he's under contract through 27. But he is the other coach that I was referring to in this division that I think could certainly be on the hot seat to a degree. Not that I expect the Bills to struggle, but if they do, if they somehow don't win the division, or if they probably will, I think they will. But if they don't, right, or if they don't advance in the playoffs, to your point, then that seat does get warmer. It does get hot. And I do think that's the one to watch. Like last year, they had no business winning the division. They won 5 straight to end the year. Miami just it just trips up on itself and they win the division. And so we'll see. Maybe that happens again. But I also look at it and say, all right, Sean, this is at some point it is prove it time where you do need to advance to a championship game, at least in the playoffs, even if you don't win and go to the Super Bowl. Getting to that point, it's something that you need to do at some point to show that you're improving and growing as a team. And the Bills haven't gotten there yet with this generational quarterback. I agree with you. I think there is some pressure there for them to find a way to get it done.
You want to know who I think has he's only in his 3rd year, but it's a guy who I think does have serious pressure on him to deliver right away, and it's because of the situation that his team kind of gave him with this past draft, and that's Matt Eberflus. Because I look at the Bears, and yeah, sure, he inherited a really, really bad situation. He has 10 wins in his first 2 seasons, and he did go up from 3 wins to 7 wins last season. So I guess that signs of progress. But to me, if I'm Matt Eberflus, and here's the thing: if Caleb Williams comes in and balls out, everything's fine. But if Caleb Williams comes in and they struggle, and this team misses the playoffs, isn't even close to it, like if they go through some really rough times, I can see Chicago being like, we don't have time to play with this. We're not waiting around. We're getting Caleb Williams, an offensive-minded coach that's going to get him to work right away. And I think they're going to give him, like, he's not going to be fired mid-season or anything like that, but Eberflus needs to make this the year. This needs to be like his Brian Daboll year where they get 9 wins and, they don't even have to make the playoffs, but get a winning record. Show Chicago like, hey, the future's coming. Like it's getting there, because the last 2 seasons, I know Bears fans can be some really loyal and dedicated people, and sometimes they need to be because it's been rough in Chicago for several years. But I look at that and I say, like, Bears fans, they might not be patient for this, and I don't think the ownership might be patient with him moving forward if Eberflus is going to be. If that has shows that there's problems with this Bears season, and Caleb Williams doesn't come out red hot, ready to go, or even if he does come out red hot and they're still losing, if they're not winning games with Caleb Williams, James, I think Eberflus could be one of those guys who ends up on the hot seat.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a good one to mention. Another one, and I'll stick with the NFC. Boy, oh boy. I don't know what the Saints are doing exactly. I think they're trying to win. I think Dennis Allen at 16 and 18 needs to show some improvement, needs to have more than just a winning record this year, maybe make the playoffs. And
in the NFC South.
Yeah, no doubt. And 9 and 8 last year, obviously it wasn't good enough. 7 and 10 the year before that. All right, so you're seeing a little bit here, a little bit there. But, man, it's a pretty darn good roster. It is. It's not great. There are flaws. I get it. But 9 and 8, you need to find a way, I think, in the NFC South. It's a really good point to get into the postseason this year. I think Dennis Allen is certainly someone that I would mention on the hot seat. He kind of goes under the radar in New Orleans right now because there's no more Drew Brees. There aren't Super Bowl expectations for the Saints, but there are in New Orleans. And they do invest in that team a ton. They kick the can down the road when it comes to the salary cap to try to build a winner and stay a winner and maintain a winner. They got to start doing some winning this season.
Agreed entirely. I think that's certainly a team that needs to get some winning in. I want to talk about some other teams that need to get some winning in if these coaches want to keep their jobs. We'll keep going through coaches on the hot seat. Is your coach on the hot seat? Stick with us. We'll be right back here on the Locked On NFL podcast.
This one may surprise you, Chris. But
okay.
As far as hot seats go, it's more of a question than it is me declaring that he's on the hot seat. But let's go to the AFC.
Okay.
And he's one of the highest paid. He might be the highest paid head coach in the NFL. Certainly one of them. Is there a scenario where Sean Payton, by the end of this year, if they're struggling in Denver, if Bo Nix doesn't look good, if he doesn't show growth throughout the year, I don't mean mid-year. Is there a scenario where Sean Payton, who's not on the hot seat now, I don't believe, ends up on the hot seat by the end of the season?
I think things would have to go like really bad for the Broncos. I feel like if they're mid this year, I think everyone acknowledges, look, the quarterback situation, they drafted Bo Nix. It wasn't always great. They knew that this was going to take some time to rebuild after they moved on from Russ. I think I think he has some grace this year. But if things are bad and it's like the house is on fire, I think that would change things, because Sean Payton was supposed to fix the culture of the Broncos. He was supposed to come in, bring winning culture and all those things, and that hasn't happened yet. And now they've sent away this quarterback that they invested a lot to get in Russell Wilson. And if they don't show progress after doing that, there's gonna be a lot of legitimate questions about that. And I do think that Sean Payton, this needs to be a year where he needs to not stink it up. And I think that there's very few coaches that are protected from one bad year. I think that there's a lot of coaches that either they've been around and one bad year could be like the ultimate sign of a doom, or they need to be able to show like, hey, like, we've been bad and one more bad season can crush us. But I think Sean Payton, there's some coaches who I think mid-years can put them in a bad spot because they have such a loaded roster. I think Sean Payton, with the situation the Broncos have inherited, he can afford to be mid to, just missing the playoffs, or, 8 wins, or like hovering around there. If he gets around that part, I think Sean Payton's fine. But if you're looking at a 4 or 5 win season, then next season will be his hot seat year.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting because it's a tough situation. I don't really know what to make of the Broncos. Could they overachieve? Could they underachieve? I'll give you one more.
Okay.
And you mentioned Doug Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
If the Jags miss the playoffs again, his seat's got to be hot-ish, right? After Trevor Lawrence's contract, after what they've done. You draft Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round to give Lawrence a true number one option in their mind.
I'm right with you there. Like that's where I was going to go next, was the Jaguars, because oftentimes when I look at hot seats and I try to say, okay, who has their franchise quarterback, who's recently drafted their quarterback or recently signed their quarterback, how have they been doing with that quarterback? And if I'm the ownership and I see that I have the guy at behind center who I think can get me to the promised land, but I don't have the coach that's putting him in the best situations, then I need to rethink how I'm handling this. And that's where I'd look at Doug Peterson. And listen, I think Doug Peterson's a very good to great coach. I think that the work that he's done. I mean, heck, he had a winning record in Philly, got them their first ever Super Bowl. And he's kind of hovering right around 500 with the Jaguars, but acknowledging like, hey, he inherited a really rough situation from Urban Meyer. He's had to retool a lot of things, and that's what he's in the process of doing. But if I'm the owner and I see that Trevor Lawrence is still struggling and not getting the numbers that you want, that the Jaguars, I mean, last year, like going into like the middle part of the year, the Jaguars were looking like, oh yeah, they're going to make the playoffs, and then they fell off. They cannot afford another fall off type year, because then that'll start to be the label for Doug Peterson in Jacksonville. And if that happens, then that's next year. And he's one of those examples where I think a mid-year of not doing anything, going 9-8, you'll be hovering right around there and not going anywhere with it. I think that could be damaging to Doug Peterson, because again, like the Jaguars, if they're paying Trevor Lawrence money, we talked about that. You and I talked about that on last week or 2 weeks ago show. But if they're paying Trevor Lawrence the big money, they're expecting big results from Trevor Lawrence. And so if Doug Peterson isn't coaching him to that, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's one of those sleeper situations where you're like, it might be nothing, and it's nothing as of now, but it could become something. And you try to forecast down the line who could potentially end up there. Overall, I think we covered all of them. I'm trying to think of who else could realistically enter the season on the hot seat. I don't really see many, because you have so many first and second year coaches. I mean, the turnover coaching wise, over half the league, it feels like is in their first or second year, maybe third. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the days of Bill Belichick and all these guys that have 10 plus years, you mentioned Mike Tomlin, he's one, but there aren't a ton of guys. Andy Reid's another. But there aren't many that have been around for a long time.
Right. And I think that's the thing is that when you establish culture on a team and you keep that culture around, I think that's what protects you. Well, I mean, one, winning protects you, but culture is a big part of how you get there. And John Harbaugh, when he came to the Ravens, he established a culture right away in 2008. And and it was kind of a rekindling what was already there. He had Ray Lewis, he had Ed Reed, he had Terrell Suggs. So like he didn't need to do that. But then when those guys aged out and they were old, but they needed to win with Joe Flacco and they needed to develop there, they did that. And then right when he was on the cusp of, it was basically public knowledge that they were going to mutually part ways in 2018. Lamar Jackson arrives and saves the day. And now all of a sudden, John Harbaugh back to being one of the best coaches in the NFL. And sometimes that's all it takes is just an insertion of a generational talent like Lamar Jackson. And that's where I think that guys like him, have made it work. But, guys like Mike Tomlin, I think Harbaugh and Tomlin are very similar in a lot of ways. And I think that, you look at Andy Reid, he has his ways about him. But you're right. But I think that's part of it is that it's very rare to find those coaches that can get it's not just about the play on the field. It's about getting to these guys, getting through to them, getting them to understand what you're asking of them, being able to connect with them and being able to challenge them in the right ways, and also knowing when to challenge them. Because if you're a coach who's just you can't just be the coach that just yells and spit flies in your mouth and you're just angry all the time. That doesn't resonate with players. There's times where you can pick the right time to be stern and the right time to challenge people. But if that's you 24/7, eventually they're going to realize yelling is just who you are, and that just doesn't mean as much. But when you have your moments where you're like, oh no, coach is serious right now, then players respond to it more. And I think there's an art to that. And I think that oftentimes when you know how to manage players, that can be the most important part of being a head coach. And I think it's why certain guys are great coordinators, but don't work out as head coach. I think the Steelers offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, is a perfect example of that. He can draw up some serious plays in Tennessee, but he is not but he was not managing the team there in Atlanta. And we even talked to him about that at minicamp for the Steelers. And he was like, we asked him is there any part of this that, is an ego part of you that you've gone from head coach back to OC and it's a step backward? He's like, you got to throw that out the window, man. He's like, we don't got time to worry about that. So I think that's one of the biggest skills. And I look around the league and I wonder who's the next coach that kind of rises up like that and gets a team to believe in them so that they can have a really long career.
Yeah, it is. You're right. The tenure element, it's just changed. Real quick before we get out of here, who do you think the first coach fired is? If you had to wager, predict it now, who would it be?
First coach fired. I'm gonna go back to one of my earlier answers, and I'm gonna say Nick Sirianni, because I think Philly is really tired of it. I also think the players got a little tired of his antics a little bit last year. And I think the NFC East, if the Cowboys are good this year and the Eagles, if they make the playoffs and then get bounced unceremoniously like they did last year by a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that was 9-8 with Baker Mayfield, I think you could see Nick Sirianni hit the door pretty fast. And that's excluding in season firings. Looking at coaches that could be fired in the middle of the season.
Yeah,
that's always tough because then you're presuming that this one team completely falls apart. But if I was to pick the person I think is on the hottest of hot seats, it's Sirianni after losing both his coordinators and seeing his team completely collapse down the stretch last season.
Robert Saleh for me would be the one. Just because there's a chance it goes great, no doubt. There's also a chance they win 3 games or 4 games or whatever the case is.
The Jets, man.
Maybe it's a little higher than that, but it's not. I mean, hell, they won 7 last year and it felt pretty chaotic. So maybe he could keep them afloat. Maybe not. That would be the one that stands out to me. Hopefully, none of them get fired. Hopefully, everyone's awesome. We are not rooting for guys to get fired. We just know it's the reality of life in the NFL. Training camp's almost here, Chris. And I know our viewers and listeners can't wait. We can't wait. And we are going to have you covered every single weekday here on Locked On NFL. So hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Follow wherever you get your podcasts. And for Chris Carter, I'm James Rapien. Thank you so much for listening and watching Locked On NFL.